This is the eLearn podcast. If you're passionate about the future of learning, you're in the right place. The expert guests on this show provide insights into the latest strategies, practices, and technologies for creating killer online learning outcomes. My name's Laddick, and I'm your host from Open LMS. The eLearn podcast is sponsored by eLearn Magazine, your go-to resource for all things online learning. Click-by-click how-to articles, the latest in EdTech, spotlight on successful outcomes and trends in the marketplace. Subscribe today and never miss a post at elearnmagazine.com. And Open LMS, a company leveraging open source software to deliver effective, customized, and engaging learning experiences for schools, universities, companies, and governments around the world since 2005. Learn more at openlms.net. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the eLearn podcast. My name's Laddick, as you just heard. But as I like to tell everyone, this show is not about me. It is about my guest, the wonderful Julie Dirksen. How are you today, Julie?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. This is actually the second time we've had you on the show.
Mm-hmm.
I think the first time was about a year and a half ago. I should have looked that up. But I'm psyched to have you on the show again. It was wonderful. You are one of the people in this online learning universe, in this instructional design universe that's I've had people actually your first book is sitting on my closet or sitting on my bookshelf right outside the door here. And I'm psyched to talk about your second book right now, but many people recommend your work. Tell us where you're sitting in the world today, and just sort of for people who haven't heard of you before, give us a little background on you.
Yeah, I'm actually in Florida right now. I'm visiting some family. I usually am in Minnesota, but it turns out Minnesota is really cold in January. So sometimes it's nice to go to warmer places until it gets done with that whole January thing. So that's where I am. And the new book is Talk to the Elephant: Design Learning for Behavior Change. So that's been kind of what I've been all about for the last few weeks. And I usually describe the kind of what we're getting at there is a lot of times we create learning experiences that are intended to change behavior, and people understand what they're supposed to do and they learn all the stuff, and then the behavior doesn't really change. You might send managers to training on how to give better feedback, and then they go back to the office and they kind of give feedback the same way that they always have. Or you might send people to safety training and then they go back and they're still not wearing the safety goggles. Or, it could be that they're supposed to update, do all of the documentation in the customer record for every contact point, and you go in and there's like nothing in the software system.
I've never seen that happen before.
No, that never happens. And so it's those kinds of things. It's they know what to do, but they still aren't doing it. And when I it's probably like 15, 20 years ago now that I got really interested in this, because I was working on an AIDS and HIV prevention project through the University of Minnesota and some other groups where they were trying to take an in-person materials and put it online. So this was maybe like 2005-ish, give or take. And by then we all knew, like we'd all heard the message about, condom usage to prevent HIV spread. And yet like, it was still happening. We were still happening. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, do you like how I went straight to condoms first thing?
That was great. I love that you threw not only sexuality, but controversy right into the podcast.
Right. Exactly. Let's go right in. I actually, when I was working on the book, I had a debate with my editor about whether or not I could put a picture of condoms on the first page of the book. And we ultimately decided not to, but nonetheless.
I think you should have used that on the cover. Like literally on the cover, that would have been fantastic.
You never know. Yeah, maybe. But anyway, the upshot of it all was I was looking at this problem as an instructional designer thinking, hey, I have got this toolkit that helps people understand things, that helps build skills, that helps people remember stuff. And none of those things were the answer to the problem that we were dealing with, right? The challenge that we were trying to kind of solve for in that particular
right.
In that particular instance. And I'm like, I feel like I need a bigger toolkit here. I feel like my toolkit as an instructional designer is not extending to this kind of situation. So what else is out there? And it took a good like 10, 15 years, but there's a lot of stuff happening in behavioral science. So which is really this sort of field that's coalescing for a lot of different domains like public health or safety or finance or whatever, all have these people who are trying to help people with behavior change. And it's kind of turning into its own domain around, behavioral science. You're starting to see things like chief behavioral officer as a job title, believe it or not, and things like that. And there was all this good stuff happening that I think is super useful, but not a lot of it was making its way back over into kind of learning and development and into our training efforts. And so that's what the new book is about. It's this whole extra tool set of things to look at or to think about when you're designing for these kind of tricky behavior problems. Because some problems are easy, like you don't know how to use this new software system. We trained you how to use the new software system and away you go. Like that's not the problem I'm trying to solve for in this book. But the whole question of like, even though you've trained people on like a whole method for delegating well as a manager, and yet they're still kind of micromanaging and keeping all the tasks, way too close, and they're not doing any of the things that they just learned. What do you do when that happens? How can you help people actually change the behavior and not just know what the thing that they're supposed to do it?
So am I right in characterizing it? It's the distinction between skill acquisition and modification of behavior, right? I mean, do I have that right? Is that the distinction,
Yeah.
or is it more refined or?
Yeah, and I mean, there's all these pieces that go into this, right? Like some things, if you are using YouTube to figure out how to change the washer in your bathroom sink, you've got an immediate need for it. You're going to go out, you're going to watch the thing, you're going to go buy, the little thing, the right size washer or whatever it is, and you're going to do it, right? Like motivation doesn't even cross your mind, right? Like maybe you've been procrastinating about the task, but like once you're underway, you're like, I'm doing this thing and I need it and I really want this to stop dripping and whatever, right? So there's lots of things where an immediate like piece of learning or education is going to be fine, and you don't need to like persuade people. Like I'm not trying to convince you anything about like that this is the best washer to use, or there's a particular way to do it, or anything like that. We're just like, we'll just give you the information and away you go. But then there's other things, and it tends to be almost every really tricky behavior change challenge I've ever seen is something where we have delayed or absent feedback, right? Like there's no immediate consequence to either not doing the thing or doing the wrong thing, or something like that. And so like if you want people, if you're trying to encourage people to like save for retirement, for example, you can not save for retirement for a really long time before bad things happen. Eventually they will. Eventually you get to the point. But when you're 23 and just starting your kind of work life, you can kick that can down the road a really long way. And so if I'm trying to help you understand the value of acting now around that as opposed to acting much later, then what am I doing? Like what kinds of techniques or strategies or things as part of an educational experience would I want to have in place that help people make some of those decisions, consider some of those future consequences. How do I take things that are too abstract and make them feel more concrete for people? That's a big one. A lot of times we're like, this is going to improve operational efficiency. Well, that's a pretty vague concept, actually. What does that actually look like? And what does that mean? And how does that help me? I understand how it helps the organization, but how does it help me? All of those kinds of things.
So before I ask my next question, I want to say thank you to both Camille, who is in Buffalo. She says love from Buffalo. So I think she's probably feeling the cold, but also Gansham. I apologize for destroying your name, sir, but he chimed in from India as well. I encourage both of you, if you have specific questions for Julie while we're here over the next 35, 40 minutes or so, throw them in the chat there in LinkedIn or on YouTube, and we'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah.
My question is, before I dive into the why, I'd like to talk a little bit more about this toolkit that you said, moving from the instructional designer toolkit to the behavior change toolkit. Could you provide a little bit more detail, especially because there's so many instructional designers that listen to this? That's one of the people in our audience, or one of the personas in our audience. What is that shift? And like, what do those behavior change tools look like? Are they actual things that you feel like hey, I know how to create graphics, I know how to, put the button in the right place, that, or are these more like, now that I'm in designing, these are different ways to design that will
Mhm.
increase motivation, etc.? Over to you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, by and large, we're really talking about design strategies. Like, what's a good way to, sort of think about this or talk about it or look at it in a way that, formulating things in a way that people can, there's like little things. There's little things that are essentially, I mean, some of them are essentially free. Like, for example, do you write is your language written in a way that is kind of chastising and yelling at people and, kind of full of lots of shoulds and musts? Or is it talking in a way that people, about all the things that people can do and what all their strengths potentially are and how they can, be more successful? So we have a tendency to like do things like focus on here's why this change is really great. Let me tell you all the benefits of this change. And instead, we should probably be focusing on here's why you'll be able to do great things once this change, is in place. Here's all the things that you can do. So even that is just a small language change, but and the content doesn't take longer to write that way, but you can write it in a way that you're kind of framing it around people's strengths, right?
Mm.
So instead of managers should do this, managers should do that, a good manager does this, you can say, hey, look, you can do these things, you can talk to your people, you can build relationships, sort of talk to people like they're human beings to begin with, right? But also b focusing on how is this going to allow you to do things that you care about, and how do we frame this in terms of the things that you value as somebody somebody in your job and in your role and in your function in the company or the organization, as opposed to here, let me shout at you about all the things that you're not doing or
Sure.
that you should be, or
Mhm.
that you'd be better if you were doing these things and stuff like that. Like fundamentally, like we see a lot of shame, trying to shame people into good behavior in the world.
Mm.
And people should know about the consequences of behavior. That's a totally fair thing. But at the same time, framing things in terms of how can I help you accomplish all the things you care about, as opposed to trying to like bully you into doing the things I care about. You know, there's pretty clear kind of consensus in a lot of the research and things like that that sort of says, look, supporting people's autonomy, helping them, tying things to their values, helping them do better in the world is going to eventually produce, stronger results than how do I focus on all the things you're doing wrong and kind of yell at you about it. And yet we, and like I said, there's no necessarily cost difference between, addressing the content one way or the other, but at the same time, having that framing, having that, kind of keeping that stuff in mind can be really useful.
100%. You are apparently have a lot of fans out there, because I want to just say hi to Kendra in Atlanta. Thanks for chiming in. Michelle in Texas there. And then Marcelo, I want to answer your question that, this is live on LinkedIn right now and on YouTube. So as soon as this conversation ends, the recording will become available, and it's automatically transcribed in LinkedIn for you. So both of those happen automatically. And then essentially, Sean, it looks like he was essentially paraphrasing your answer. It's like
Hmm.
a big piece of this is what's in it for them as you're
Yeah.
designing, making the case, or at least designing in a way where it's like, wait, these values are something that we share, or this outcome is something that is good for you as well. And so
Yep.
therefore, the answer is kind of why not? Do I have that correct?
Yeah, and even I've had kind of a twitchy relationship with what's in it for me for a long time. I think fundamentally it's right, and I 100% agree with what Sean's saying. But I also kind of sometimes like to reframe it as what can I do with this? So instead of what's in it for me, it's what can I do with this, which is not as nearly as clean an acronym. But the how can I take this and use this to solve a problem that I have right away? How can I do something with this that makes me feel better about my job, makes me feel more competent, makes me feel like I learned something and now I can go and use it. And so that's it's a subtle difference between what's in it for me, but it is this sort of focus more on what are these capabilities that I'm going to have that I can do something with that helps me do other things that I care about. Like that's a very virtual cycle if we can get people into that mindset.
Mhm.
And that's what they're doing with their day a lot of the time, but we are often trying to like distract them from the things that they care about to pay attention to the things we care about. And they don't have to be mutually exclusive. They can overlap.
100%. So, there's a very, very solid question from Andrew that I'm going to get to in just a second. I want to go one more piece down this rabbit hole, which is there a juxtaposition or a difference or a distinction that you would make from nudging, for example, where it's really, my understanding of nudging is just, it's presenting options in a different way, or maybe, for instance, I believe the classic example of is organ donors on on driver's licenses. Rather than asking, do you want to do this? They simply just change the question to,
Right.
if you don't want to do this, if this is a bad idea, then tell us no. And what they found was that organ donor, acceptance went up by some
Mhm.
ginormous percentage amount. Is there a distinction there, or is it all part of the same thing?
It's in there. So when I went looking for tools in the toolkit, like one of the first things that really resonated was the book Nudge, which is Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And they talk about the organ donor example in there, right? And they looked at several European countries, and the ones where the default was already selected were somewhere in the 80 to 90% likelihood that they would kind of continue on and sign up to be an organ donor versus the countries where they had to actually click the box to say, yes, I want to be an organ donor. And that was more in like the 20 to 30% range for those countries. And undoubtedly that nudge is great. More people signed up for organ donors means that probably, ultimately you are going to improve that. Now, the challenge though, is that like, that's a whole system, right? Like that moment where somebody signs up on their driver's license is good, but there's also all of the other stuff that goes in. Like, is this person kind of communicating to their family members that they are interested in being an organ donor, or did they just kind of blow past this, right? And that's going to lead to a different outcome if, some bad thing happens and their organs are,
Donated.
being discussed for organ donation or things like that. And then in addition to that, there's the whole system around organ donation. How easily is it to, transport the organs or to make use of the organs or, have, all of these kinds of things. So all of the stuff that sort of plays in, that nudge is great, but it's probably in and of itself not enough to, change kind of the whole spectrum of things. And so nudges are, and again, they talk about choice architecture when they talk about nudges, which is how do I frame this choice in a way to support the best behavior that we can. And they've looked at it, for marketers know all of this stuff, right? Like the marketers arrange the cereal aisle of the grocery store very carefully to try to nudge certain behaviors, right? They know what height the sugary
Well, see, but
cereals need
here's
to
the thing.
be.
I always question that because I'm 6'2", so I mean, like I'm looking at different cereals than my kids, but they
Yeah.
put them where the kids see them. Darn it.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. Yeah, absolutely. They're very careful about that stuff. And so the idea of nudges is not necessarily an exclusive thing, and it absolutely comes into play. So the model that the book is kind of framed around is this model called COMBI, which is part of the behavior change wheel. And the person who kind of led the effort on that is this researcher out of University College London's Center for Behavior Change, Susan Mickey. And she and her team did a kind of a review of many different behavior change models that existed in a lot of domains and tried to bring it into a single model. And the COMBI element of it looks at, is the person capable of making the change, which is usually our domain. We usually worry about capability. Can I train this person to do the thing, right? But then we look at opportunity too. And the opportunity could be their physical environment. Does the system support it? So it's great if they've chosen to be an organ donor on their driver's license, but at the same time, if there's no kind of way to follow up on that, or there's no way to like help that then communicate their wishes to their family, or any way for that to be, kind of taken into account when somebody goes to the hospital for something, whatever the questions are, then the opportunity is not is not there in terms of the behavior actually kind of following through. They also look at social. Do I see other people doing this behavior? Do I have social support for me doing this behavior? Again, that's where the family would really come in. They have to support this choice too. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter what they pick on their driver's license, right? Like it fundamentally is going to come down to, other people participating in that decision. And then we look at motivation. And there's two things with motivation. One is, what values do I have? What goals do I have? Like things that I can talk about, right? Do I have a goal around organ donation? Do I have values around organ donation? What do I think of that? Do I think it's something I should do? Do I think it's something that I don't care about? Like how do I literally feel about it? But then there's also all of that unconscious stuff. So habits and biases and things like that are also going to influence behavior. So an example I sometimes use is flossing, right? Like I can know I should floss, right? So I have that knowledge. I can know how to floss. I'm, probably reasonably competent at it. So there's that piece of it. I can even really want to, like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to floss my teeth regularly. And then, but then like we still have this habit piece at the end of it, right? So one was knowledge, one was motivation or attitude. And then we still need the habit to happen. And that has a whole set of different things that you do to support habits that aren't necessarily about like, if I'm concerned about motivation, I'm going to like show you pictures of gum disease, or I'm going to like explain how flossing really does this amazing stuff, or I'm going to convince you that, if you want to have a full set of teeth, when you're 70, you really want to do this, or whatever the things are, right? But if I'm trying to help you build the habit, I'm not still talking about like why flossing is good. I'm talking about, okay, let's look at your day and think about where would you likely floss and what is causing you not to floss right now. Do you have floss? Do you have, what kind of floss have you had the best experience with? Maybe you should get more of that. Maybe you need a couple of those little floss things that sits on your desk, which is what I do personally.
Well, I've been really fascinated recently in the sort of physical fitness and exercise world. I've been paying attention to some people, and I love these, these slow. It's not a slow habit. I don't want to say slow, but it's this very step-by-step habit forming moves where it's like, look, if you want to find yourself working out, just start driving to the gym or wherever you want to exercise on a regular basis. You don't have to go in. You don't even have to get out of your car. Just go there and then go home. And then the next move is, okay, actually get out of your car and go in the door and just kind of like take that 2 minutes or 3 minutes and be there and then go. And then, over the course of a 6 weeks period, suddenly you have built this habit of showing up, getting dressed and actually being, and then, wow, then it's a matter of picking up weights or whatever, running on the,
right.
And that it's been profoundly powerful of, that step-by-step method of whatever. Do we design that into learning though? Do we design that as well?
Yeah, I think you can. I mean, you can't do everything, right? But for example, one of my favorite things in kind of the habit space is something from the researcher is Richard Goldwitzer, and he talks about implementation intentions. And it's just really simple. It's an action plan. If this happens, I'm going to do this, right? So if X happens, I'll do Y. And this has been around for quite a while, and it's very simple, but it's really, if you think about it, sometimes you use the example of like, you want to quit smoking, and the things that are likely to derail you in your effort to quit smoking are like boredom, stress, habits, whatever. So what you do is you go through and you create an action plan for each of those, right? If I have a craving to smoke because I'm bored, I'm going to play Candy Crush on my phone, right? I set up my plan. I create the implementation in my head. I know what I'm going to do. So when that happens and I get twitchy and I want a cigarette, I'm going to play Candy Crush on my phone. If I get a craving to smoke because I'm stressed out, I'm going to call my sister. She knows that that's the plan. She's ready to talk me down or to distract me or whatever it is, right? If I get a craving to smoke because it's a habit, like I always used to smoke after lunch, I'm going to take a loop around the building and one of my coworkers is going to go with me. So like I have a plan in place for when that thing happens where I need to exert, what we sort of think about as willpower and things like that. And I know what I'm going to do. So I don't have to think about it. I don't have to decide. I don't have to expend energy figuring it out. I know exactly what the plan is, and I'm just going to execute when that thing comes up. And so that's a really simple thing that you could add into a training curriculum is, like, hey, you're supposed to give more feedback to your direct reports based on this managerial training. Let's create a series of implementation intentions. So when somebody sends me a status update on a project, I'm going to stop and give them a little bit of feedback on something that they did with that, right? Or whenever, I run into somebody in the coffee, in the kitchen because we're getting coffee. I'm going to say, hey, you know what you've been doing really well lately? It's this thing, and sort of set up a series of little implementation intentions, because one of the big problems we have is we all get into autopilot, right? That's where the habit stuff is really, hard. And stopping yourself and interrupting some of those habits is quite frankly, kind of one of the hard parts. You need a cue or trigger that makes you go, wait, I was supposed to do something here. What was it? Oh yeah. So, but like adding in the opportunity to like help people understand the importance of those kinds of little action plans, and then create some for themselves on their way out of the training. Again, this isn't an expensive thing. Like it wouldn't take a long time to do, but it could really make a big difference in terms of, hey, I'm just going to send you out into the world and you're supposed to do the right thing, versus you've got a clear plan. Here's the trigger that's going to tell me it's time to use it. Here's the action I'm going to take.
So many great questions over here in the comments. I want to make sure we get to some of them. First, I want to say hello to Joanne from Montreal. Thanks for chiming in there. Andrew Muccio, I apologize again for your family name, is asking if leaders are focused on productivity and profitability metrics as the behavior change they want to seek. Are there ways that you recommend, implementing behavior change to, move those levers? And his kind of following up, he says, or do you try to shift the leaders towards looking at other metrics?
Yeah. I mean, obviously when we're talking about kind of communicating value, it has to be something they care about too. So, one of the questions I'm always want people to know is what budget line item is paying for whatever it is that they're doing, and what things are tied to that. Like, what does success look like for that person? What do they care about, right? And sometimes it's kind of tough, right? Like they care about getting it done fast, and you care about it being effective. And so what can you navigate in that space, that's sort of still satisfying to the person who's signing off on this, but is also getting to that sort of more effective measure for their own part. And the truth is, like some of the training we do, like compliance training or something, the only metric that lots of people care about is that the box is checked for, in case they get sued as a company, they can say, yes, we trained these people on this, right? And so they don't actually care if it works, or they don't care if it's changing behaviors. And in fact, they're probably teaching people behaviors they'll never use because it was part of a legal requirement. And that stuff that's really difficult. But one of the challenges we have is that we have historically done kind of a bad job of showing the benefits of, the behavior changes that occur because of training that we're doing. And instead focus on, we got everybody through the training. So,
right.
And the challenge with that is then the way you show improvement on we got everybody through the training is you do it faster and cheaper. The way you show improvement on here's the outcome of this is we made it more effective. We can do more, and it can even be even more effective in the future. And so if you get yourself stuck in this loop of the only way I can show improvement is to do it faster and cheaper, well, I mean, that's not by definition less effective, but there's a good chance that those two things correlate, so.
All right, thanks for that answer. Kendra Fabry has a question I want to paraphrase for you here. She's been thinking about the intersection of design for a blend of cognitive learning theory and behavior change. And so she wonders if you have any insight into the power of persuasion and motivation of seeing the talking head of the presenter in e-learning and recorded slideshows, because there's some say that adding that cognitive load is a negative thing, but she's also heard that there's a benefit. So I guess the question is, I've heard the theory where it's, if you have the talking head and then you've got the bullet points going down, it's actually less effective than just the bullet points. Over to you.
Yeah, so there's a lot to that one. There's been a decent amount of research, and I don't know that I've seen the absolute most recent of it on the kind of the sort of talking head piece and things like that. We as humans have an affinity for people's faces, so there's a whole, kind of like I think it's the Fujiform gyrus, but don't quote me on that, where it's this facial recognition piece and things like that. So seeing somebody's face and being able to kind of look at their, see their eyes, look at their facial expressions and things like that, there is an attention, aspect to that, right? We also know from some research that was done kind of in the mid 2000s that you're a little bit more likely to listen to somebody who sort of feels and sounds and looks like you. And so then there's some benefit to that. So for example, if you're doing, you know, financial literacy classes for a particular audience in a particular place, you want whoever's talking about it to not be somebody who looks completely different from everybody in that target audience. You want somebody who feels like they could be part of that target audience. And we know from things like all of the stuff that's been happening in terms of like YouTube or TikTok or whatever, that people, kind of, there's something about that audience proxy, or, somebody who like feels like they get you, feels familiar to you, all of those kinds of things. So those are all arguments that kind of sort of suggest that hearing from that person is good. Now, if it's somebody reading a script and they're clearly disengaged and all of that kind of stuff, like it probably doesn't help you all that much. But somebody who feels like they're genuinely talking to you. So we know that sort of pro-social or parasocial connection is part of it too, right? That feeling like you're really like interacting with a person. I mean, like I said, the YouTube and the TikTok world and things like that is full of people who feel a social connection to the person that they go out and watch these videos. And so there's something there as well. If this person says, hey, do this behavior, because it helps with this and this and this, and I feel a connection to that person because I've been watching them for a long time, or I trust what they're telling me, those kinds of things can have a big influence. The seductive augmentation piece is sometimes like adding extra bells and whistles to something can actually detract from that cognitive learning. And therefore we want to be a little bit careful about it. I think the fundamental idea of like the talking head is a little bit neutral in that we're so used to it. We're doing it right now, right? Like, we're the talking heads. And so I think it probably doesn't have too much distraction effect just because it's something we're so accustomed to, right? As opposed to like if I'm sticking dancing cats and unicorns in my video, my L&D videos, that would be weird. And that would be a distraction. And that would probably, be more of a cognitive cost from that seductive augmentation point of view. But yeah, sorry, this one has lots of pieces. I'm
just thinking my daughter would probably like the cats and unicorn. I don't know.
You know what? I would too. Quite frankly, but it also might. The potential is if you add those things in, people like them, but they don't necessarily support learning. So if I'm doing, again, financial literacy with dancing unicorns, people will come away and they'll really remember the dancing unicorns, but they may not remember like what an APR is. So.
Right. Fantastic. I want to say hello to Jimmy from Texas. Thanks so much. Andrew says, thank you for answering his question. Another question before I get, there's an anonymous user who just put a question about video, but before I lose the thread here, earlier you were talking about, you gave some great examples of behavior change in terms of like, hey, when you go to the break room and you see somebody, this is a moment to give a compliment, or hey, when somebody files a product update, give them feedback. Is there any difference or change? I'm thinking of a reductive or a different, like sort of a backwards in. We know that we're in a world of distraction. Right. And that's one of the hardest parts about habit changes, because we're constantly distracted by, the things that we're surrounded by. Do you find incorporating those into learning or whatnot, where maybe it's like, hey, look, rather than immediately responding to those product updates, create a process where they all go into one thing that you check every Thursday, and then do all of that at the same time, because that's not only more efficient, but it's more productive, etc. Do you see where I'm going with this question? It's like,
oh yeah,
reducing rather than increasing.
Yeah, no, and one of the things about this is the strategy that will almost always pay off. Like there's other strategies like choice architecture nudges or something where it's like, maybe it did some good, maybe it didn't. And you obviously want to test these things out because you want to make sure you're not actually doing damage, right?
Mhm.
There's been a lot of research into, kind of focusing on extrinsic motivators actually damaging things like intrinsic motivation. So like if I pay kids to draw pictures, they quickly start drawing the fastest picture they can. So quality goes out the window and they actually get tired of it sooner because once they've gotten, a certain amount of money, like
Right.
this isn't
Mhm.
fun anymore. Versus if you just let kids draw pictures, they'll do it for hours and be really happy doing it. And so it's one of these things where we want to be careful about like some of the ways that we choose to incent behaviors because we can actually make it, worse. Like there was a real trend for a while about fitness and wellness programs that supported, like paid people, like they gathered points and then they could trade them in. Well, there was a story that I sometimes refer to in Oklahoma City. I think it was Oklahoma City. Um, uh, uh, I'm sorry that the dog is providing a little distraction right now. I
No
don't know if
worries.
you can
It's
hear
very,
it.
I
Okay.
can
Yeah.
barely hear it. It's not a
Okay, good.
distraction at all. No, no,
Cool,
no.
cool, cool. Speaking of
We
distractions.
we have so many
Um,
dogs out there. It's not a big deal.
yeah.
Not a big
The and what happened is like 5 employees managed to embezzle about $300,000 worth of these wellness benefits
Mhm.
before they were done. And on one hand, they were totally winning the game. On the other hand, it was also illegal and it wasn't really what the goal was of the program. So you always want to be careful about these things. But when we're looking at this, how do we support the behavior? How do we make the behavior as easy as possible is always going to pay off. Like some of these other nudges, maybe they will, maybe they won't. But how do I make this easy and simple for somebody to do, right? How do I structure the environment in a way that it's easy and simple for them to do? Like that one pretty much always works.
Yeah, sure. How
so
does that? Yeah.
so it's always worth asking, is there something that we can do to make this behavior easier for our users to do? And that's a good starting place um, versus trying to convince them that it's more important to do it, right? You can
Mm.
lean on, I could make you want to do it more, or I can make it easier to do. Like start with easier to do and then worry about can I make them want to do it more? Like, and sometimes you can't make it easier, right? Like you don't have the ability to change the way that the computer system works. Or there was one I was working on it was a very complicated healthcare system, and they were like, well, they need to click the gray box, the sort of blank gray box at the bottom of the screen to add a new record. And I'm like, are you seriously telling me we can't just add the words new record to the gray box? I have to teach them that the
Yeah.
gray box is how they
Sure.
how they add a new record. Really?
Mhm.
So yeah, the bottom line though is, if you can make it easier, do that, and then try to figure out some of this other stuff.
Fantastic. The anonymous user, apologies that we don't know who it is, but is asking, we know that video is a powerful form of communication and wondering if you can share your thoughts on how we can leverage video as a training material or a training medium to include behavior or inculcate behavior changes. Are there particular techniques or things that you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, people's perception of how difficult something is to do plays into it. So seeing examples of people doing it and going, "Oh, that doesn't look so bad. That looks
Mhm.
actually pretty straightforward." To my YouTube example at the beginning of changing the washer on your faucet or something like that. Like go out and there's been several little home improvement things where I go out and I'm like, oh, that doesn't look that hard. I can probably do that. And, obviously they're giving me the knowledge of how to go about it, but honestly, also just providing the example of seeing it and seeing it done and going, oh, that completely makes sense. Or that sort of social norming of like, hey, most people are doing this and they're talking about how successful it is for them. That's another strategy I don't see used very often. There's a lot of powerful motivation around, oh, everybody else is doing it.
Mm.
I should too.
The herd
Okay.
mentality. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Mhm.
And I mean, like, we sort of sometimes talk about that in a derogatory way, but it's really like, we spend a lot of time kind of, checking out, is this important or not? Oh, those people whose opinion I respect think it's
Mhm.
important. I should
100%.
probably think it's important too. And it's a shorthand for like doing all the back, the sort of legwork yourself to figure it out. But honestly, it's a shorthand we all need sometimes,
Mhm.
and unfortunately it can be manipulated, and there's downsides to a lot of these strategies. But the but fundamentally, like if you go out to an Amazon page and you're deciding if you're going to buy, Julie's new book or something, there's going to be stuff from the publisher. There's going to be stuff that I wrote. There's going to be some nice quotes from people who like me, and then there's going to be the reviews from audience members. And which of those is going to be the most persuasive in terms of do I care about this book or not? I
Sure.
mean,
100%.
yeah, pretty much everybody would agree it's going to be the the words from the audience members. Although I just saw a book recently that had it was a new book that had a lot of reviews and they all sounded strangely similar.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't think I care what ChatGPT has to say about this book.
100%. Yeah, no, we don't need to go down that path quite,
No,
in this
no,
particular conversation.
no names,
I
nothing
want
like
to
that.
commiserate too. So I think I gave this example actually either on the last episode of the podcast or before, but my son had a key missing from his laptop for more, and I hate to admit it, for more than a year.
Mm-hmm.
Right, there's one of these little the right
Yeah,
arrow
one of
key,
the pride off or
and
something.
here it is over the holiday break. Just a few weeks ago. I looked up the YouTube video about how to replace this, and I found it for $10. I'm like, I've been waiting for a year to do, and that immediate motivation was like, oh my Lord, I can do this, and immediately.
Yeah.
But I also really caught into it as well. I think that, and I don't mean herd mentality in a derogatory way or a bad way either. Like, we do need that shorthand in a lot of ways, because it's something I've said to lots of people as well. It's like, you could ask me that spreadsheet question, but I bet you there's probably 400 million people who've asked that. That's where, can I Google that for you,
Mm-hmm.
comes in as well. And so those are the kinds of things that motivate you in that direction as well. Carolina, she's from Atlanta. Thanks for joining us. She's asking what needs to be in the implementation intentions. I'm not sure if that question is complete enough for you. Does that make sense?
Well, it's the if X happens, then I'll do Y. So you need to identify the trigger that's going to tell me that I need to use the behavior, and then you need to encourage people to identify the behavior that they're going to do when that happens. And a big key with the implementation intentions is that while I, as the instructional designer, can suggest some examples so people know what I'm talking about, fundamentally the users should construct their own. Like that is way
Mhm.
better than me saying, hey, when you're waiting for coffee, maybe you could floss your teeth, right? Like waiting for your coffee to brew, you could floss your teeth, because I don't know, maybe you don't drink coffee, or maybe you don't brew coffee. You do one of those little pod things and it's, over too fast. Or maybe like you use a shared kitchen with, other people because you live in a, group house, and the idea of flossing your teeth in the kitchen is kind of gross and you don't want to do it. Like there's all sorts of reasons. I'm stretching now, but you get the idea. Like there's all sorts
Yeah.
of reasons why I shouldn't be the one telling you what your X and Y are in that statement. If X happens, I'll do Y. But you can absolutely make time in any kind of good learning experience with behavioral change as a goal to help people structure their own and make their own plans kind of going forward.
Fantastic. Julie, we've already taken 45 minutes of your time, which I cannot thank you enough of. What is the best way for people to reach out to you? We have one more. Kendra is going to ask you, could you speak to building coaching into the training event follow-up or to achieve these kinds of benefits? So maybe building coaching into a training event.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is we have this tendency to be like, we're just going to send you to training and then it's over, and that there isn't any kind of like reasonable follow-up. And in the book, one of the things I talk about is kind of like there's a whole slew of things that can be involved with a good kind of learning experience, especially one focused on behavior change. That might be pre-learning things like identify a problem you want to solve, or here, read this article, or do some things ahead of time. Pre-work is obviously its own little stressor, whether people do it or not. But then there's the actual things that happen during the learning event. Then there's practice and getting feedback on your efforts if it's skill-based or something. Then there's feedback, coaching, mentoring. Then there's just-in-time support. So going out to YouTube to find the thing about replacing the key versus like you wanted to just learn that one thing. You didn't want to learn like laptop maintenance,
No, yeah,
Right.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the motivator,
Mhm.
I find the motivator, sorry to cut you off. The motivator there is that we called the support desk and they said, oh yeah, that's going to, that'll be a, $400, some extraordinary amount. And I'm like,
Oh
there's no
no.
possible way this is a $400 fix,
No, no,
like,
no.
and that was the motivator, right? There was some moment
Mhm.
that was unacceptable, right?
Yep.
Mm.
Then there's refreshing things that need to be dealt with so every so often, like kind of we don't want the behavior to erode or people to forget about it. So like cybersecurity probably needs to be refreshed periodically, right? You do good practices around that. And then there's how do people develop further? How do they go on to the next step if it's kind of a more complex skill or something? And so you kind of can look through that map and think about, well, what can I do at each of these points to support it? And if I can't do anything because once they're out of this, I lose them, how can I help support the person who is dealing with the next step down the line? Can I build materials that help managers support the behavior that can I treat the managers as my secondary audience and think about how do I support them in this? How do I help them do the right thing? So looking at all of these different pieces down the line and looking at it kind of more as the sort of across the system, how am I going to support this? One of the other things, it's a tool on my website. So if people want to go out and get it, there's a free download for this sort of change ladder tool, and it kind of takes you through 10 steps. It's like, does the person not know the behavior? Do they know about it, but they're not convinced? Are they convinced, but it's not a priority? Is it a priority, but they're not sure what they should do next? Are they intimidated by the behavior? Do they feel like it's too difficult? Do they try to do it and they need some additional support? So depending on where somebody is all along that process, there are different things you can do to support them as they kind of move through this. So it's not just tell them louder and more emphatically that they have to do this thing. TheusableLearning.com is perfect. And if they want some specific resources on it, it's usableLearning.com/elephant is the place to go for that. But yeah,
Sure was
otherwise
thinking I had a great one for you.
oh yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. So there's stuff out there, and I'm also on LinkedIn. I have a Facebook group called Design for How People Learn for lots of instructional designers. And I'm actually doing some workshops coming up with the Learning Development Accelerator on that whole issue of communicating and helping people see value. And then I'm going to do a full-blown version of the behavior change workshop. And I'm going to do that one next month. And then I'm going to do a full version of my behavior change workshop in May. So I'm around.
Awesome. Now, this has been, as usual, I feel like I could probably listen to you talk about this for the next 2 hours. I will give you back your life, but thank you so much. Thank you to Carolina, Kendra,
Yeah, and thanks
Jimmy,
everybody for the
Camila,
questions.
Andrew, everybody for showing up and asking some great questions today. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.